Your children owe you respect. That's what society tells us. That's what we as parents have believed all our lives. You raised them, sacrificed for them, and gave them everything. So naturally, they should respect you. But what if I told you that's not how it works? The truth is, respect is not something you are entitled to. It's something you must cultivate. If you feel like your children are ignoring you, dismissing you, or even treating you like a burden, it's not because they've forgotten what you did for them. It's because, without realizing it, you may be holding on to an attachment that is creating suffering rather than respect. Welcome to Buddhist Wisdom for the Elderly, where we share timeless teachings to help you live with dignity, peace, and fulfillment in your later years. In today's video, we'll explore 8 profound shifts that can help you regain your children's respect, not through arguments, not through guilt, but through the quiet power of presence and self-respect. The Buddha taught that attachment leads to suffering, while inner peace leads to freedom. If you have been waiting for your children to appreciate you, longing for their attention, or feeling unseen, this video is for you. And make sure you stay until part number 5, because this one lesson alone can unlock an entirely new way of living in your later years. If you find this wisdom valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're on a journey to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us continue creating content to uplift and empower elders around the world. Now let's begin. 1. Set boundaries. Gain respect. There is a quiet dignity in knowing your worth, in understanding that the way people treat you is in part a reflection of what you allow. Yet for many parents, especially as they grow older, this sense of self-respect begins to waver. You raised your children with love, with patience, with sacrifice, and yet, somewhere along the way, you find yourself being interrupted mid-sentence, your words brushed aside, your presence taken for granted. You tell yourself, they're busy, they don't mean to be disrespectful. And so, you stay quiet. You smile, even when you feel disregarded. But deep down, there's a sadness that settles in, a quiet realization that you have become someone who is listened to only when it is convenient, who is valued only in the moments they choose. But what if I told you that respect is not something others give you? It is something you cultivate within yourself. And when you hold it firm, others begin to reflect it back to you. This is something Henry had to learn. Henry had spent most of his life as a respected businessman. In his younger years, his words carried weight. People listened when he spoke, and his opinions were valued. But at home, it was a different story. As his children grew into adults with families of their own, he began to notice a shift. They interrupted him in conversations, dismissed his concerns, and made decisions without considering his input. At first, he let it go. He told himself it wasn't worth the fight. He convinced himself that staying quiet was better than causing conflict. But over time, that silence turned into something heavier. It made him feel invisible. One afternoon, as he sat watching a documentary about Buddhist monks in the Himalayas, he heard a teaching that struck him deeply. It spoke of mountains, how they do not ask permission to exist, how they do not bend to the wind or rain. They simply are, strong, still, unshakable. And in that moment, Henry realized something. He had spent years bending, yielding, accommodating. And in doing so, he had unknowingly taught his children that it was okay to overlook him. So, the next time his son interrupted him, Henry calmly said, "I will continue speaking when you're ready to listen." His son looked surprised, but he fell silent. When his daughter dismissed his opinion with a casual wave of her hand, Henry did not argue. He simply said, "You don't have to agree with me, but you will speak to me with respect." At first they pushed back. They were confused by the change. But Henry did not waver. He did not raise his voice, nor did he argue. Like the mountain, he stood firm. And slowly, something changed. His children began to pause before interrupting. They started listening, really listening when he spoke, not because he demanded it, but because they could feel that something within him had shifted. The Buddha once said, "Do not seek to control others. Instead, master yourself." Enforcing boundaries is not about controlling your children's behavior. It is about setting the standard for how you will be treated. It is about standing firm in your worth, not with anger, not with frustration, but with quiet certainty. Because when you become unshakable in your self-respect, the world around you will begin to adjust. 2. Stop chasing approval. They'll respect you more. There is a gentle pain that settles in the hearts of aging parents, a quiet ache that comes from feeling overlooked, from realizing that the love you gave so freely is not always returned in the way you hoped. You spent years nurturing your children, guiding them, sacrificing without question, and yet now you find yourself waiting for their call, for their visit, for a simple moment of recognition. But the waiting often turns into longing, and the longing into suffering. This kind of suffering has a name in Buddhism. It is called tanha, craving, attachment. It is the grasping at something outside of ourselves to give us meaning, to make us feel whole. And like trying to hold water in our hands, the more tightly we cling, the more it slips away. I once knew a woman named Elise. In her youth, she was a strong and independent spirit, full of laughter and purpose. But as she aged, something changed. Slowly, almost without realizing it, she began centering her life around her children's needs. She rearranged her schedule to accommodate them. She bit her tongue when they dismissed her words. She told herself, if I just keep giving, if I just keep quiet, they will see how much I love them, and they will love me back the same way. But the opposite happened. The more she gave, the less they seemed to notice. The more she sacrificed, the less they respected her. It was as if, in her efforts to be needed, she had made herself invisible. One day, after another unreturned call, Elise sat by her window, watching the rain ripple across a pond in her garden, and a thought came to her, clear, quiet, profound. The pond did not reach for the rain. It did not beg for the water to fall. It simply was, still, whole, at peace. And when the rain came, it received it without desperation, only acceptance. In that moment, Elise realized she had been chasing something that could never be caught. She had been seeking love in a way that made her lose herself. And so she made a decision. She would stop waiting. She would stop bending. She would stop making herself smaller in hopes of being seen. She started speaking her truth, not with anger, not with demand, but with quiet dignity. When her children made plans without her, she made her own. When they spoke over her, she held her silence until they were ready to listen. And something remarkable happened. Slowly, her children began to look at her differently. They started making time for her, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Because she had stopped seeking their approval, they began to value her presence. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." This is the heart of the lesson. If you tie your happiness to the way others treat you, you will always be at their mercy. But if you cultivate your own inner peace, if you learn to be still like the water, you will find that respect and love flow to you naturally, without the need to chase, without the need to beg. So if you feel like your children do not appreciate you, do not make yourself smaller. Do not bend yourself in hopes of being loved. Instead, be like the still water. Be whole on your own. And in that wholeness, you will find not only peace, but the quiet, unshakable respect that you have always deserved. 3. Why relying on your kids for happiness pushes them away. There is a quiet loneliness that many parents feel but seldom speak about. The years of raising children, of wiping away their tears, of putting their needs before your own. It all becomes so deeply woven into your identity that when they grow up and drift into their own lives, you are left with a silence that feels heavier than it should. You wait by the phone, hoping it will ring. You wonder if today they will think of you, if today they will have time. And when they don't call, your heart tightens just a little. So you call them instead. At first, they pick up. They sound happy to hear from you. But after a while, you start to notice a shift. The warmth in their voice isn't quite the same. The conversations become shorter. Sometimes they don't pick up at all. This is what happened to Lillian. Lillian had been a devoted mother her entire life. She had poured everything into her children, her time, her energy, her love. And in return, she had expected nothing. Or at least, that's what she told herself. But deep down, she did expect something. She expected that her children would always need her, that she would always hold a central place in their lives. When they were younger, they came to her for everything. Every scraped knee, every school problem, every heartbreak, they always turned to her first. But as they grew older, they turned elsewhere. Friends, careers, their own families. And suddenly, Lillian found herself on the outside, watching as they built lives that no longer revolved around her. She started calling them more often. At first, they were kind, but over time she sensed a hesitancy in their voices. "I'll call you later, Mom. I'm just really busy right now. I promise I'll visit soon." But later never came. The visits grew fewer, the calls even less. And then one day, after yet another unreturned call, she sat by her window, watching the breeze ripple through the trees. She felt an ache she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just loneliness. It was the realization that she had built her happiness around something she could not control. In that moment, she remembered something she had once read about the lotus flower. The lotus does not cling to the water around it. It does not beg for the sun to shine upon it. It simply blooms, standing tall, beautiful, whole within itself. It does not wait for anything outside of itself to complete it. And so, Lillian decided to change. She stopped waiting. She stopped calling first. Not out of anger, not to punish them, but because she understood that her joy could not depend on them. She picked up painting, something she had loved in her youth but had long forgotten. She joined a small local gardening group, where she met others who, like her, were looking for meaning beyond their roles as parents. She started visiting the park in the mornings, sitting quietly under the trees, just being present with herself. And then something unexpected happened. Her children started calling more. They wanted to hear about her life, about the things she was doing. They asked for advice, not because they felt obligated, but because they saw her as someone wise, someone who had a life of her own. They respected her, admired her in a way they hadn't before. This is the truth many parents struggle to accept. When you let go, when you stop making your happiness their responsibility, they are drawn back to you, not out of guilt, but out of genuine love. The Buddha once said, "You yourself, as much as anyone in the universe, deserve your love and affection." True peace comes not from waiting for others to fulfill you, but from finding fulfillment within yourself. When you are whole within, others are naturally drawn to your presence. So if you find yourself waiting, yearning for your children's attention, I ask you to pause, to breathe, to remember that just like the lotus, you are already enough. You do not need to chase love, because love, when given space, always finds its way back. 4. When giving too much makes them stop appreciating you. There is a deep joy in giving. As parents, we don't think twice before extending a hand to our children, offering them everything we can, our time, our resources, our wisdom, and most of all, our love. Giving is natural to a parent's heart, a quiet way of saying, "I am here for you, always." But there is a moment, a painful one, when you realize that your generosity is no longer met with appreciation, but with expectation. And expectation, when left unchecked, turns into entitlement. I once knew a man named Samuel, a kind, generous father who had spent his life providing for his children. When they needed money, he gave without hesitation. When they needed advice, he dropped everything to listen. When they needed help, he was there before they even asked. And for years, this made him feel good. It reassured him that he was still needed, that his role as a father was still important. But over time, something changed. His children stopped saying thank you. Instead of appreciation, there was assumption. They no longer asked for help, they expected it. And the worst part, when Samuel finally needed something from them, when he was sick and asked his son to take him to a doctor's appointment, his son sighed and said, "Can't you take a cab, Dad? I'm really busy today." That moment stayed with him. Not because of the words, but because of what they revealed. He had spent his whole life giving, but in the process, he had unknowingly taught his children that his help was not a gift, it was a guarantee. Samuel felt hurt, but more than that, he felt invisible. Had he done something wrong? Wasn't it a parent's duty to give, to sacrifice? He struggled with these questions until one day he had a conversation with an old friend, a retired Buddhist monk named Ananda. Ananda listened to Samuel's pain and then shared a story. "Imagine a man walking through a village with a bowl of rice," he said. "Whenever someone asks for food, he gives. He gives and gives until his bowl is empty. And then, when he himself is hungry, he looks down and realizes there is nothing left. He cannot feed himself. He cannot continue his journey. He has given everything away without wisdom, and now he suffers." "Is this true generosity?" Samuel shook his head. "No," he said, "because he didn't take care of himself first." Ananda smiled. "Exactly. The Buddha taught that generosity, true generosity, must come from a place of balance. Giving should uplift both the giver and the receiver. When you give endlessly without boundaries, you do not build love, you build expectation, and expectation leads to suffering." Samuel thought about this for a long time, and then he decided to change. He stopped offering help before it was even asked. Instead of immediately saying yes, he paused and asked himself, is this something they should handle on their own? And most importantly, he started saying no when it wasn't in his best interest. At first, his children were confused, even annoyed. They had grown used to his endless giving. But slowly, something remarkable happened. They started calling him, not just to ask for help, but to check in on him. They started appreciating the times he did say yes, because now his generosity was no longer an expectation, it was a gift. If you feel like your giving is being taken for granted, ask yourself, am I giving in a way that encourages gratitude and respect, or am I enabling entitlement? The Buddha taught that a candle does not lose its light by lighting another candle. But what he also taught was this: if you let your own candle burn out, you will have no light left to give. Give, but give wisely. Help, but set boundaries. Because when you respect your own generosity, others will too. 5. Live for yourself, not just for them. There is a kind of silence that settles in after years of raising children. It is not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of waiting. Waiting for a call, for a visit, for a sign that you are still an important part of their world. Many parents feel this deep in their hearts. They spend years dedicating every moment to their children, believing that love means making them the center of their universe. And then one day, they wake up to realize that the universe has shifted, and they are no longer at the center of it. This was exactly how Miriam felt. Miriam had been a devoted mother her whole life. When her children were young, she was their world, wiping their tears, packing their lunches, staying up late whenever they were sick. And when they grew older, she remained their anchor. She was always available, always ready to listen, always putting them first. But now in her late 70s, things were different. Her children had families of their own. They were busy. They visited on holidays, called occasionally, but the long conversations, the everyday moments, the feeling of being needed, those were gone. She found herself sitting alone in a house that was once filled with laughter, looking at old photographs, waiting for the phone to ring. At first, she didn't think much of it. This is how life is, she told herself. Children grow up. They have their own lives. But deep inside, the loneliness settled in like a shadow that followed her everywhere. One evening, she was watching the rain through her window when she thought about something she had once read in a book about Buddhist philosophy. It spoke of a river, how a river does not wait for someone to tell it where to flow. It moves forward, carves its own path, adapts to the stones and obstacles in its way, and continues. That night, Miriam had a realization. She had spent her whole life waiting for her children to need her, waiting for them to bring meaning to her days. But like the river, she needed to find her own path again. So she made a choice. She signed up for a local art class. Painting had always been something she loved as a child, but never had time for. She started going for morning walks at the park, where she met others who, like her, were looking for companionship beyond family. She joined a reading group at the community library, and slowly, something within her changed. She no longer woke up thinking about when her children might call. She no longer sat by the phone hoping for an invitation. She had things to do, places to be, people to meet. And then, something remarkable happened. Her children started calling more. At first, it was out of curiosity. "Mom, what have you been up to?" Then it became admiration. "That's amazing. You started painting again?" And soon they began making time for her, not because they felt guilty, but because they respected the life she was living. The Buddha once said, "Do not seek refuge in others, but find it in yourself." Many parents unknowingly place their happiness in the hands of their children, believing that love means dependency. But love is strongest when it is given freely, without expectation. When you build a life outside of them, when you show them that you are living, not just existing, they see you in a completely different light. Not as someone waiting, but as someone thriving. And in that, they find a new kind of love for you. Not one of obligation, but one of genuine respect and admiration. So if you ever feel forgotten, if you ever feel like you're waiting too much, ask yourself, am I flowing like the river? Or am I standing still, hoping someone will move me? The moment you start moving, the moment you start rediscovering your own joy, your own purpose, your own fulfillment, your children will see you differently. And more importantly, you will see yourself differently. 6. Let go of the past. Find peace. Many elderly parents carry the weight of unspoken regrets, past sacrifices, and unresolved pain, memories of the times they gave everything to their children, only to feel distant from them in later years. Thoughts like, did I do something wrong? Have they forgotten everything I did for them? Can bring immense suffering. But in Buddhism, there is a profound teaching, impermanence, anicca. It reminds us that everything in life is always changing. Just as the seasons shift, so too do relationships, roles, and the dynamics within a family. The pain does not come from change itself, but from our resistance to it. I knew a woman named Rosa who struggled with this deeply. She had 3 children, whom she had devoted her entire life to raising. But as they grew older, they moved far away, started their own families, and no longer needed her in the same way. She felt abandoned. One day, as she sat in her garden, she watched a tree shedding its leaves. She remembered something she had once read. A tree does not mourn the loss of its leaves. It lets them go, knowing that new growth will come. That day, she made a decision. She would not cling to the past, but embrace the life she still had. She started focusing on the beauty of the present, her health, her small but meaningful joys, her old friends she had neglected while prioritizing her children. And as she let go of the pain of what once was, she found something surprising: peace. When you release the past, you create space for new moments of happiness. The Buddha said, "You can only lose what you cling to." Your children's love for you still exists, but it may look different than before. Instead of seeing their distance as neglect, see it as part of life's natural rhythm. Let go, breathe, and trust that in surrendering the past, you will find peace in the present. Number 7, the one shift that brings more joy than any phone call. It is easy to focus on what is missing, the visits that don't happen, the phone calls that never come, the feeling of being overlooked. But what if, instead of focusing on what's absent, you turned your attention to what is still here? Gratitude is one of the most powerful tools for shifting your perspective and inviting joy back into your life. And gratitude in Buddhism is not about ignoring difficulties. It is about seeing the light, even when there is darkness. I met an elderly man named Thomas who struggled with loneliness. His wife had passed, his children were busy, and he often felt forgotten. One day, his grandson visited and asked, "Grandpa, what are you grateful for today?" At first, Thomas couldn't think of much. But then he paused. He looked out the window and said, "The sunlight feels warm on my skin today." Then he thought again, "I had a good cup of tea this morning." Another pause. "I still have the strength to go for a walk. And my grandson is here asking me this question." That one question changed everything. Instead of waking up thinking about what he had lost, Thomas started each day asking himself, "What am I grateful for today?" He began to notice the small joys, his neighbor's kindness, the taste of fresh fruit, the sound of birds in the morning. And the more he practiced gratitude, the lighter he felt. He smiled more, engaged with others more, and radiated a peaceful energy. And soon, people were drawn to him, not out of duty, but because he had become someone who found beauty in everyday life. The Buddha said, "Let us rise up and be thankful, for if we didn't learn much today, at least we learned a little. If we didn't get much, at least we didn't get sick. If we didn't get what we wanted, at least we didn't lose what we had." Happiness is not found in having more, but in seeing more. If you focus on what's missing, you will always feel empty. But if you focus on what is still here, you will realize you are already full. 8. Earn respect without saying a word. There is a moment in every parent's life when they realize that the way their children see them has changed. The warmth, the reverence, the quiet respect that once existed begins to fade. Maybe your words are brushed aside. Maybe your concerns are met with sighs or eye rolls. Maybe when you try to correct them, they laugh as if your wisdom no longer holds weight. And it hurts, not just because of the disrespect, but because of what it represents. The feeling of becoming small in the eyes of those you once carried in your arms. The instinct in these moments is to fight back, to raise your voice, to remind them of the sacrifices you made, to say, "Don't you see what I've done for you? Don't you remember who I am?" But think for a moment. When was the last time an argument ever changed someone's heart? When has fighting for respect ever truly earned it? Buddhism teaches us that true strength is not in force, but in presence. The moment you argue, the moment you let frustration guide you, you give away your power. You tell them, "You have control over my emotions. You can pull me into anger, you can shake my peace." And once they sense this, the balance shifts. You no longer lead, you react. I knew a man named Josh, a retired school teacher. In his classroom, he commanded respect. His students listened when he spoke, not because he shouted, but because they knew his words carried weight. But at home, things were different. His grown children dismissed his advice. They cut him off in conversations. Sometimes when he tried to guide them, they would smirk as if to say, "What do you know?" At first, Josh did what many parents do. He fought back. He argued. He raised his voice, reminded them of the years he had spent providing for them, teaching them, sacrificing for them. But nothing changed. The more he pushed, the more they pulled away. Then one day he made a decision. He would stop trying to prove himself. He would not argue, not demand, not try to force their respect. Instead, he would embody it. From that day forward, he carried himself differently. He spoke less, but when he did, his words were measured and firm. He listened, not to argue, but to understand. And when they dismissed him, he did not react. He simply let his presence speak for itself. And something remarkable happened. Over time, his children began to notice. they began to feel the quiet strength in their father. He had not raised his voice, yet he seemed more powerful than ever. He had not demanded their respect, yet they began offering it freely, not because he forced them to, but because he had shown them what true dignity looks like. The Buddha once said, "A wise man, when spoken to harshly, does not return harshness. He speaks with kindness and remains unshaken, like a deep, still lake." If you want respect, do not argue for it. Do not chase it with words. Simply be the person who commands it. Because in the end, it is not the loudest voice that holds power. It is the calmest heart. In Buddhism, the greatest power does not come from force, but from presence. The Buddha did not demand respect. He embodied wisdom, kindness, and self-mastery. And those who saw this naturally followed him, not because they were forced to, but because they were drawn to his way of being. This is the key to earning respect in your own life. If your children have started treating you with less care, less consideration, or less respect, do not waste your energy on anger, resentment, or longing. Instead, shift your energy inward toward wisdom, toward peace, toward self-respect. Throughout this video, you have explored 8 powerful Buddhist lessons that can transform your relationships and your sense of self. 1. Set boundaries. Gain respect. Like a mountain, stand firm and teach others how to treat you. 2. Stop chasing approval. The less you seek validation, the more it will come naturally. 3. Withdraw emotional dependence. Your happiness should not be in someone else's hands. 4. Stop giving without appreciation. Give with wisdom, not obligation. 5. Live for yourself, not just for them. A fulfilled life commands admiration. 6. Let go of the past. True peace is found in embracing the present, not clinging to what was. 7. Shift to gratitude. When you focus on what you have, rather than what is missing, joy follows. 8. Earn respect without words. Your energy, not your arguments, defines how others see you. When you apply these shifts, something incredible happens. Your children start to see you differently, not as someone waiting for their approval, but as someone who embodies dignity and self-respect. And over time, that respect will return, not because you demanded it, but because you became someone worthy of it. The Buddha once said, "Do not seek refuge in others, but find it in yourself." That is your path now, to stop chasing, stop waiting, and instead, start living. Which of these Buddhist teachings spoke to you the most? Share in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts and wisdom. If this video resonated with you, please like and subscribe. We are on a journey to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us continue creating content that empowers and inspires. Thank you for watching. Remember, respect is not something you ask for, it is something you embody. See you in the next video. May you walk this path with peace, strength, and wisdom.